They had braced themselves for cages, starvation, and humiliation, but instead, the first thing the German women prisoners of war noticed in the American camps was the smell of fresh coffee. The first thing the German women prisoners of war noticed in the American camps was the smell of fresh coffee. They had prepared themselves for brutality. Nazi propaganda had promised them it would come. In the last months of the Reich, Goebbels' broadcasts warned that capture by the Allies meant rape, humiliation, and death. Posters in ruined train stations showed grotesque caricatures of American soldiers and carried one message: surrender is slavery. When they disembarked in New York and New Jersey in late 1944, escorted by MPs and Red Cross nurses, they waited for the blows. None came. Instead, they were lined up, registered, deloused, issued wool blankets, and handed trays of food that belonged to another world: white bread, butter, and coffee that was not brewed from acorns or barley. For many, it was the first real coffee they had tasted since 1941. At Camp Shanks, the primary processing center for German POWs entering the United States, 48 women from mixed auxiliary units, the Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht Clerical Corps, and medical detachments were housed separately from men. The guards spoke little German. Their indifference was the first wound. They expected hatred. They found a procedure. Each woman was photographed, fingerprinted, and asked for rank, unit, and place of capture. The Americans avoided insults. They avoided even eye contact. When one interpreter joked that the women were lucky to be here before winter, the remark sounded less like cruelty and more like bureaucracy. In later testimonies, this absence of hostility became the defining memory. Erna Keller, a signals operator captured in Normandy, later wrote, "They treated us as if we were already harmless. That was worse than being struck." The voyage from Europe to America had taken 3 weeks. The holds were dark and smelled of diesel and salt. The women had rehearsed in silence the horrors they expected to endure. When they were led from the docks to waiting trains, escorted by unarmed MPs who offered cigarettes, the cognitive dissonance began. By the time they reached Camp Swift in Texas and Camp Atterbury in Indiana, disbelief had hardened into suspicion. They searched the food for hidden meaning. They ate, but they did not trust it. They waited for the punishment to begin. It never did. The shock was not comfort. It was indifference. The Americans did not see enemies. They saw administrative entries, supply counts, and shipping manifests. The women realized that vengeance did not motivate their captors. They were motivated by efficiency. For the prisoners of a regime built on ideology, that was incomprehensible. In the American camps, everything functioned with mechanical precision. The trains that brought the German women from the ports of New York and Boston to the interior of the United States ran on time. Guards rotated shifts every 8 hours. Meals were served at fixed intervals. The same order that had crushed Germany under bombs now surrounded its prisoners with an unnerving calm. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, the first major facility to receive female German prisoners, the commandant noted in his report, "Prisoners well behaved. No incidents. Camp operating at 96% capacity. Rations are adequate." The sentence might have described livestock, not people. For the women, the routine was disorienting. They woke to bugle calls, not air raid sirens. They stood in line, not for rations but for attendance. The guards rarely spoke except to issue instructions. When they did, the tone was flat, without contempt or pity. Most women had been trained to see capture as dishonor. Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe auxiliaries were taught that surrender equaled betrayal. Yet the Americans treated them as statistics. Their uniforms were confiscated, their rank erased, and their identities replaced by numbers printed on paper tags. For prisoners, this bureaucratic neutrality felt worse than hostility. American policy toward prisoners of war followed the Geneva Convention of 1929. which required humane treatment, adequate food, and access to medical care. By late 1944, the United States had established more than 500 POW camps across the country, housing nearly 425,000 German soldiers. The inclusion of women, nurses, clerks, and radio operators was an administrative anomaly, not a deliberate act of mercy. Red Cross inspectors visiting Camp Atterbury in Indiana noted the unusual discipline among the female detainees. They did not attempt to escape. They did not protest. They simply observed. "The prisoners exhibit a curious composure," the report read. "They are alert, distrustful, and quiet." Quiet became the defining sound of captivity. At night, the camps hummed with electricity, the dull rhythm of generators and the distant sound of American trains. The women heard music on the radio, Bing Crosby, the Andrews Sisters, Glenn Miller, and realized that the war seemed far away to those outside the wire. Letters arrived through the Red Cross, censored but intact. Some contained news of destroyed towns, missing brothers, or the death of parents. Others carried strange reports from home. Allied leaflets promising reconstruction, rumors of Allied soldiers distributing chocolate to German children. The women began to realize that the world they had left no longer existed. In their barracks, they spoke little. Their conversations revolved around disbelief. "If this is captivity," one said, "then what was freedom?" By December 1944, as snow fell over the Midwest camps, the American Guards celebrated Christmas with decorations and carols. The women watched from behind wire fences as the soldiers exchanged gifts and drank coffee laced with whiskey. On Christmas Eve, a chaplain asked if the prisoners wanted to attend Mass. Most declined. A few went out of curiosity. The chapel was simple: wood, pine garlands, and a cross draped with white cloth. When the choir sang Silent Night, the melody was the same as the women had known since childhood. For a moment, the boundaries between captor and captive blurred. Same hymns in two languages, under the same sky. No one shouted. No one hit them. The war was still raging across oceans and continents, but inside the barbed wire of America, something unthinkable was happening. The enemy was being treated like a war guest. Realization was slow, almost painful. The women had been prepared for cruelty. They were not prepared for decency. Instead of blows or shouted threats, they faced brisk questions, indifference, and paperwork. The silence of expected cruelty became louder than violence would have. In the American system, interrogation was a matter of record-keeping, not vengeance. Intelligence officers were instructed to remain professional, efficient, and detached. The goal was not confession, it was information. The women were asked about supply routes, radio codes, unit movements, and the morale of German troops. They were not yelled at. They were not struck. Most were thanked afterward. At Camp Shanks, the processing center outside New York, the interrogations were held in converted offices once used for American mobilization. A sergeant recorded names while a lieutenant translated the questions. A stenographer typed steadily in the background. The women had been warned by German officers that interrogation meant torture. What they found instead resembled a bureaucratic interview. Hilde Kramer, a captured Luftwaffe clerk, later described it in her memoir. They asked about my work, my superiors, my city. I kept waiting for the real interrogation to begin, for someone to shout or strike, but they just wrote notes. When they were finished, one of them offered me a cigarette. The absence of brutality unsettled them more than cruelty would have. For years, they had been taught that their enemies were monsters. Now, they sat across from men who looked at them the way accountants look at ledgers. To the Americans, the women represented minor intelligence value, support personnel, not frontline soldiers. The interrogations were formalities. Yet for the prisoners, every calm exchange dismantled another part of the myth they had been raised on. The Americans were not propaganda beasts. They were something worse, ordinary. The intelligence reports from these sessions, declassified years later, reveal how methodical the process was. Each prisoner's statements were logged under administrative, morale, or technical. Analysts rated reliability on a scale from A to E. Few comments referred to behavior. When they did, the tone was clinical. Subject cooperative. Nervous at first. No evidence of mistreatment required. After the interviews, the women were returned to their barracks. Some cried, not from fear, but from disorientation. The absence of punishment felt like a moral vacuum. We could not understand why they were being kind, wrote Gerda von Ronke, a captured field nurse. It made us feel like ghosts. Rumors spread through the camp that the interrogations were an elaborate prelude, that kindness was merely preparation for betrayal. When no betrayal came, the prisoners were left with something worse than suspicion: doubt. By late December 1944, the American interrogators had completed their files. The women were transferred in small groups to labor detachments, laundries, canneries, and textile workshops established near the camps. They signed forms agreeing to voluntary work, though refusal carried no punishment. Most agreed out of boredom or habit. The rhythm of obedience was hard to unlearn. In one report filed by Lieutenant Harold Mason, the supervising officer at Camp Atterbury, the tone was matter-of-fact. Prisoners respond well to structured activity. Morale is steady. No incidents. Behind that sentence lay a quiet collapse. The German women who had marched through the ruins of their homeland believing in sacrifice and martyrdom now folded American uniforms, canned peaches, and mended sheets for the army that had defeated them. They did it in silence. They had entered captivity expecting pain. What they found was irrelevance, and that, to many of them, felt like the beginning of true defeat. On the transport ships to America, seasickness and fear gnawed at them. Guards kept their distance, offered food, even water, but never struck them, leaving the women suspicious, waiting for the moment the mask would drop. The voyages began in the summer of 1944 and continued until the war's final months. Most of the captured German women came from Western Europe: clerks, nurses, radio operators, and auxiliaries attached to the Luftwaffe or the Wehrmacht's administrative branches. They were rounded up in France and Belgium after the Allied breakthroughs, placed in holding areas near Le Havre or Southampton, and then loaded onto troop transports bound for the United States. The journeys took between 12 and 17 days. The ships were crowded, airless, and reeking of oil and salt. Each compartment was fitted with triple-tiered bunks, iron ladders, and a single latrine for dozens of prisoners. Many women vomited the first 3 days. American guards distributed seasickness tablets and bread. Some prisoners refused the food, convinced it was drugged. Others ate and were overcome with shame for accepting it. The first convoy, carrying female prisoners, arrived at Camp Shanks in late August 1944. The official manifest listed 417 prisoners, most men, 22 women. They had been separated at the docks and placed under the care of the Women's Army Corps. The Americans had little precedent for handling female POWs. The procedures were improvised from manuals designed for male combatants. A Red Cross observer recorded, "The women displayed great composure during embarkation. They appeared dazed upon arrival, fatigued but orderly. Treatment was correct, humane, and without incident." That phrase, "without incident," became the summary of their passage from a collapsing Reich to the industrial calm of the United States. No guards shouted. No hands struck them. The journey was marked instead by routine: roll call, rations, lights out. During the nights, the women lay awake in the steel-bellied dark of the ship, listening to the drone of engines and the steady beat of waves. Every sound reminded them of bombs. The same machinery that had once brought destruction to Europe now carried them toward captivity. They spoke little. The presence of American sailors above deck was both comfort and humiliation. These were men they had been taught to despise, and yet they were the ones keeping them alive. Occasionally, an officer would descend to check the compartments. His tone was polite, professional. "Is everything all right here?" The women would nod, too startled to respond. The Americans never lingered. For the prisoners, the Atlantic itself became a kind of purgatory, a space between the worlds they had known and the one that waited. They had left behind bombed cities, ration cards, and an ideology that promised either victory or death. Instead, they found themselves sailing toward something worse than defeat: uncertainty. In her diary, Erica Lang wrote, "The ocean feels endless. We are floating between two worlds, neither of which wants us. The Americans see us as cargo. The sea looks at us as prey." The irony of their situation was not lost on the few who still believed in the Reich. Germany had built ships to project power. Now those same waters carried its daughters as prisoners. The Atlantic convoys that once ferried U-boats and dreams of empire were now vessels of quiet surrender. When land finally appeared, distant, green, and vast, it brought no relief. The Americans did not cheer their arrival, nor did they mock them. They simply directed them down gangplanks and into trucks. The women expected the moment of reckoning to begin there. It did not. They were processed, inventoried, and dispersed inland. The journey that had begun in the chaos of collapsing Europe ended in the symmetry of American order. The sea had been rough, but it was not the waves that broke them. It was the realization that their captors' restraint was not mercy. It was indifference, and for many, that realization began the slow erosion of everything they thought they knew about war, honor, and humanity. When the trains rolled inland, the German women expected the landscape to resemble propaganda visions of America, decadent, industrial, and hostile. What they saw instead were farms, fields, and quiet towns that seemed untouched by war. From the train windows, they saw long stretches of open land, white houses with porches, and children riding bicycles along dirt roads. The sight felt surreal to those who had grown up with ruins and ration lines. No bomb craters, no blackout curtains, no rubble. The country that had crushed the Reich from the air looked impossibly whole. At every stop, the guards allowed local Red Cross volunteers to pass along sandwiches and coffee to the military escorts. Occasionally, one of the American women handed an apple or a cigarette to the prisoners. The German women stared in silence, unsure if it was mockery or pity. At Camp Atterbury in Indiana, the arrival was efficient and silent. Rows of wooden barracks stretched behind barbed wire. Guard towers overlooked the perimeter, though few rifles were visible. A sign outside the main gate read, U.S. Army Service Command, Prisoner of War, Area B. Inside, the prisoners were processed with the same orderliness as soldiers. Each woman received a numbered tag, a cot, a blanket, and an issue of work clothes marked PW. They were instructed on camp rules. No violence, no escape attempts, no fraternization with guards. In return, they would receive food, medical care, and labor. The tone was procedural, neither cruel nor kind. For the women, the most striking difference from Europe was abundance. The mess halls served meat several times a week. White bread was common. Potatoes, vegetables, and coffee appeared daily. After years of scarcity, this regularity was almost indecent. Lieselotte Brandt, a 23-year-old typist from Hamburg, later said in an interview, "It was not the food itself that shocked us. It was the ease with which they gave it. In Germany, we starved the fatherland. Here, they threw away bread crusts. It was like seeing another planet." The camp library carried English-language books and magazines. American guards sometimes handed them illustrated issues of Life or Collier's as gestures of goodwill. The images of smiling families, movie stars, and advertisements for new cars clashed violently with the reality the women remembered. Cities in ashes, trains full of refugees, children without shoes. The distance between the two worlds could be measured in silence. In their first weeks, many women avoided looking directly at the Americans. When ordered to work in laundry facilities or agricultural details outside the fences, they kept their eyes down. But over time, the rhythm of captivity eroded fear. Guards spoke to them as workers, not enemies. "Morning, ladies," one would say, as if greeting factory employees. The casual tone confused them more than threats ever could. For some, monotony became unbearable. They had been taught that endurance meant sacrifice, that suffering was proof of virtue. Here, suffering had no place. They were simply expected to exist, follow schedules, and wait. Waiting itself became a form of punishment. At night, they heard American music drifting from the guard quarters. Jazz, swing, songs filled with laughter. The same nation that dropped bombs on their homeland filled the air with rhythm and lightness. It was not cruelty, it was indifference, and that indifference weighed heavier than hate. When snow began to fall that first winter, the camp grew quiet except for the hum of generators. The women stood in the yard watching flakes settle on the barbed wire. Someone remarked that even the snow seemed cleaner here. The war continued elsewhere. Far away, loud and brutal, but inside the wire, the world felt paused. They were prisoners, but also witnesses to a version of peace they could not comprehend. For the first time, some began to wonder if everything they had been told about the enemy was wrong. By early 1945, the German women prisoners had settled into a pattern that resembled employment more than imprisonment. The camps functioned with a discipline that mirrored the military. Roll call at dawn, breakfast at 6, work assignments by 7:30. Everything ran on schedule, with American precision and absence of emotion. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be assigned non-military labor. The women were directed to textile workshops, canneries, and laundry facilities that serviced nearby army bases. Others were loaned to agricultural programs during harvest months. Each received a small payment in canteen credits, redeemable for soap, stationery, or extra food. It was not generosity. It was policy. At Camp Ruston, a Red Cross report dated February 1945 recorded, "Female prisoners employed in laundry operations demonstrate efficiency and good discipline. Morale is stable. No disciplinary incidents." The sentence could have described factory workers rather than captives. To the women, labor became both comfort and humiliation. The tasks were mechanical, but they offered rhythm, purpose, and distraction from uncertainty. Folding uniforms and mending canvas was less degrading than idleness, yet each completed stitch reminded them of the uniforms that had once symbolized power. Erika Lang, the Red Cross nurse captured near Cherbourg, later wrote, "We worked with American soap and American needles, sewing buttons for the army that had destroyed ours. I told myself it was survival, but every seam felt like betrayal." The American guards treated the labor system as logistics. They measured output, not emotion. For them, the women were labor units. For the prisoners, the work was an equation of dignity versus obedience. Refusal was rare. There was nothing to resist. Beyond the fences, local civilians occasionally glimpsed the prisoners marching to work details. The sight of German women, neatly dressed in faded khaki marked PW, provoked curiosity rather than anger. In small towns near the camps, Abilene, Ruston, Atterbury, the war felt distant. Farmers waved, children pointed, and the women walked on, silent and expressionless. American supervisors noted their discipline. "They perform with exactness," one officer wrote. "No idleness, no complaints." But discipline had ceased to be a virtue. It had become reflex. Inside the barracks, evenings were quiet. Some prisoners sketched landscapes from memory. Others wrote letters that took months to reach Germany. The censors darkened anything mentioning fear or despair. Words like loneliness and shame appeared as black bars on thin paper. Occasionally, chaplains visited the camp to offer religious services. Attendance was voluntary. Few went. Faith has become a complicated concept. To pray for deliverance seemed absurd when deliverance had already come from the enemy. As spring approached, rumors began to circulate. Rumors of Germany collapsing, of Hitler hiding, of cities burning. The women listened in silence to the guarded radio broadcasts piped into the camp mess halls. The American news reports mentioned victories at the Rhine, the liberation of concentration camps, the capture of generals whose names they recognized. The reality of defeat arrived not through violence, but through headlines. Each morning, they woke to the same order and the same indifferent kindness. The Americans continued to provide food, medicine, and routine. The guards rotated for home leave. The prisoners stayed. Routine became the architecture of captivity. Days stacked on days, indistinguishable except for the weather. The women who had once measured life by air raids and alarms now measured it by meal times and work shifts. The war that had defined their lives was ending somewhere far beyond the wire. Inside it, they continued to live by a timetable that had nothing to do with ideology, only endurance. When VE Day finally arrived in May 1945, the camps did not erupt in celebration. There was no announcement, only a subtle change in tone. The guards smiled more. The mail came faster. The women understood without being told. The Reich was gone. No one shouted. No one hit them. The silence remained. News of Germany's surrender did not arrive with the ceremony. It appeared first in whispers from guards, then in the clipped voices of American officers who made no effort to dramatize it. "It's over," one of them said to a translator at Camp Atterbury. "They signed yesterday." The message spread slowly through the barracks, repeated in low voices as though saying it aloud might make it true. For German prisoners, the war's end was not liberation. It was confirmation of what they had already suspected during those long, quiet months of captivity, that their country had died while they were still alive. The Americans made no speeches. The camp routine continued. Breakfast at 6, roll call at 7, work assignments at 8. The silence with which victory was administered was almost polite. For the first time, the guards addressed them less as prisoners and more as responsibilities waiting for repatriation. In early May 1945, official memoranda from the War Department instructed that all German prisoners will be informed of the cessation of hostilities and treated henceforth under peacetime conditions until repatriation can be arranged. For women, the difference was invisible. The food did not change. The barbed wire did not come down. Only the sense of purpose dissolved. Letters from home began to arrive sporadically, many bearing the marks of multiple censorship offices and delays of months. They described cities in ruins, Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, where streets had no names anymore and families lived in cellars. Some letters were written by strangers explaining that the addressee's relatives were dead. Others came from mothers pretending everything was intact. "We have bread now," one wrote, "and the neighbors are kind." The women read those lines again and again, uncertain whether to believe them. So interrogators returned briefly, this time not for intelligence but for background checks on political affiliation. The questions were bureaucratic. "Were you a member of the party? Did you attend any political meetings? What was your opinion of National Socialism?" The tone was neutral, the answers rehearsed. Most said they had only followed orders. The Americans wrote everything and thanked us. For the first time, inmates began to see cracks within their own group. Some spoke openly of guilt, of disbelief in the ideology that had brought them here. Others defended it still, saying defeat did not mean wrongness. By evening, the debates became tense. But even these conflicts lacked energy. The will to believe had eroded with distance. The American officers observed the change with detached curiosity. Morale remained steady, though introspection increasing, one report noted from Camp Ruston. Several female prisoners have expressed confusion at humane treatment by U.S. personnel, given reports of Allied atrocities circulated in Germany. Confusion became their dominant state. The war that had promised clarity, good and evil, victory or death, had ended in ambiguity. Their enemy had fed them, clothed them, and allowed them to sleep without fear. Their homeland had demanded loyalty and rewarded it with destruction. One evening in June 1945, an American chaplain gave a sermon in English outside the women's compound. The topic was forgiveness. The guards stood quietly, hats in hand. Some prisoners listened from afar, unable to understand the words but recognizing the tone. When he finished, he bowed his head and left. No one clapped. That night, Erika Lang wrote in her diary, "We believed the war would end in fire. Instead, it ended in silence. I do not know what to feel. Perhaps that is the punishment." By summer, camps began changing. Barbed wire fences were repaired less often. Watchtowers stood empty for hours. The guards' discipline relaxed, though they remained courteous. The women were allowed to write more letters, to walk farther within the perimeter, to visit small camp gardens where tomatoes and beans grew under the American sun. They were no longer enemies. They were remnants. The term used in U.S. Army paperwork was disposition pending. It meant waiting, an indefinite category between prisoner and civilian. That condition, waiting for something undefined, became the final phase of their captivity. They'd survived the Reich, the voyage, and the war itself. What none of them had prepared for was surviving peace. The first sight of Germany stunned them more than the ocean had. From the rail cars that took them inland from the ruined ports, the landscape looked less like a country and more like a wound. Whole cities had been reduced to stone and ash. Bridges lay broken across rivers. Church spires stood alone in fields of rubble, the only vertical shapes left standing. The German women who had spent months or years in orderly American camps returned to a homeland that no longer existed. The contrast was immediate and brutal. In the camps, they had learned to live by schedules, mealtimes, inspections, roll calls. In Germany, there was no timetable left. Everything was improvisation and scarcity. The Allied authorities received them not as soldiers, but as displaced civilians. They were processed through repatriation centers where identity papers were issued, health checks conducted, and interrogations repeated. Each woman was asked about her wartime service, her knowledge of Nazi party activities, her attitude toward the new administration. The tone was bureaucratic, almost identical to the American interviews they had endured months earlier. The difference was that now their own conquerors were questioning them on their own soil. For many, the experience of returning home felt like another captivity, only without order. At the British-controlled camp in Lübeck, one officer wrote in his report, "Repatriated German female POWs display calm demeanor, moderate discipline, and notable disbelief at domestic destruction." The phrase notable disbelief understated the shock. Women who had folded clean sheets in American laundries now stepped into streets where walls no longer existed. Hunger replaced structure. The rations they received on arrival were smaller than what they had eaten as prisoners. The bread was darker, the coffee synthetic again. They quickly learned that the American camps had fed them better than their own country could. Some tried to return to their families. Many found only strangers in the places they once called home. Parents were missing, husbands dead or still in Soviet captivity. Children did not recognize them. The war had stretched time until memory itself no longer fit reality. In Hamburg, where Erika Lang was assigned to a displaced persons registry, the city was half demolished. She wrote in a letter that survived among Red Cross archives, The Americans gave us bread without asking our names. Here, we beg for ration cards and stand in line with ghosts. I don't know which is captivity and which is freedom anymore." The irony was clear even to the Allied administrators. A British colonel overseeing repatriation noted, "Many female prisoners express preference for conditions in U.S. custody over current domestic situations." It was a bureaucratic way of recording despair. Germany in 1946 was not a nation, but a geography of survival. Factories lay silent, railways broken, homes unheated. The moral structure that had sustained faith in the Reich was gone, and nothing had replaced it yet. The returning women spoke little of their captivity. In the ruins, the past had become dangerous to mention. The words America, camp, or coffee carried too many meanings. To admit that the enemy had treated them humanely felt like betrayal. Silence became a habit. Years later, when historians collected their testimonies, that silence still hung over every recollection. Asked about their time in America, most began with the same sentence: "No one hit us." It was not said with gratitude, it was said with confusion. They had entered the war believing in struggle and sacrifice. They had survived captivity through obedience. Now, in the ruins, neither struggle nor obedience meant anything. They had learned that mercy could exist without kindness, and that defeat could feel softer than victory. The barbed wire was gone, but its order lingered. Even in freedom, they woke early, folded their clothes neatly, and waited for instructions that never came. The Americans had defeated their bodies. The war had defeated their beliefs. Peace, at last, defeated their certainty. The war was over, but it did not end. It continued in memory, in silence, and in the way the German women measured every kindness afterward with suspicion. For most of them, captivity in the United States became a subject they avoided entirely. In the new Germany that emerged under occupation, there was little room for such stories. They had survived not through heroism, but through endurance, and endurance had no monument. By 1947, most of the female prisoners had been processed, released, and forgotten. Their names disappeared into administrative ledgers marked "Repatriated, no further action." A few found employment as clerks or nurses under the Allied authorities. Others married, moved, or simply vanished into the anonymity of post-war reconstruction. The war had erased many things. Their captivity was one of them. When journalists later sought accounts of German POWs in America, the stories that survived were almost entirely male. The men had been more numerous, more visible, and easier to frame as symbols of national defeat. The women's experience, quiet, bureaucratic, and defined by the absence of cruelty, did not fit the narrative of tragedy or redemption. It was too ordinary and too revealing. In oral histories recorded decades later, the pattern was consistent. They spoke without bitterness, but with an unease that never seemed to fade. "They fed us, they clothed us, they did not hate us," Hilda Kramer said in a 1972 interview. "That was the hardest part to explain when we came home. How do you tell people the enemy treated you better than your own government ever did?" Historians who studied the American POW system later described it as one of the most extensive and regulated programs of the war. Between 1942 and 1946, over 425,000 German prisoners passed through more than 500 camps across the United States. Of these, only a small fraction were women, but their experiences mirrored the system's defining characteristic: efficiency without malice. It was that efficiency, not compassion, that left the deepest mark. The women who had expected torment instead encountered a nation so confident in victory that it no longer needed to hate. For a generation raised in propaganda and absolute loyalty, that realization dismantled everything they had been taught about power. After their release, many carried that contradiction quietly through their lives. They never forgot the taste of real coffee, the smell of clean soap, or the way the guards spoke without contempt. These small memories lingered like fragments of another world, proof that civilization could survive war without losing its shape. Yet memory was also betrayal. In the Germany of the 1950s, still rebuilding its identity, few wanted to hear that the enemy had behaved honorably. Silence became survival once again. When asked, they replied simply, "We were in America. It was fine." Nothing more. For the Americans, the episode barely registered. The camps were dismantled, the barracks reused for returning veterans or migrant laborers. The reports were filed and forgotten. The war moved on to new narratives: Nuremberg, Berlin, the Cold War. But for the women who had crossed an ocean as prisoners, the memory never quite dissolved. It returned at night in the rhythm of trains, in the smell of bread, in the sound of music drifting through open windows. They remembered the strange safety of the enemy's camps and how that safety had unsettled them more than fear ever had. Erika Lang, whose diary survives in fragments, wrote her final entry in 1948. "They taught us that kindness can be a weapon too. It breaks you quietly, without blood. I'm grateful, and I'm ashamed." The post-war years turned memory into history, and history into footnotes. By the time the last one died, the world had rewritten their story into statistics. But in those statistics lay a lesson that war rarely teaches: that victory measured by restraint can wound as deeply as defeat. The German women who entered captivity expecting cruelty found something colder and more precise: indifference wrapped in order, humanity without empathy, mercy that asked for nothing in return. It was not forgiveness they remembered, it was the silence, and in that silence, across the wire and the ocean, they understood the paradox of their generation. They had survived the war, but the war had already taken from them the ability to feel certain about anything again. They had been ready to die for an idea. Instead, they lived long enough to learn that ideas die faster than people. No one hit them. No one screamed. No one was punished. The enemy had simply watched them, fed them, and forgotten them. And that, in the end, was the hardest thing to survive.